The work week in France began with newspaper headlines such as the one seen in Libération, which says, "The war against France," with pictures of two childhood friends who, according to Paris, were executed during a botched rescue effort somewhere along the Mali-Niger border. The Figaro newspaper shows Antoine de Léaucourt with his fiancée from Niger, who he was to wed in the coming days. Headline is, "Terrorism, France on the front line." During the coming 40 minutes, we're going to try to piece together what happened between Friday evening when the groom-to-be and his best man were dining in a restaurant some 700 meters from Niger's presidential palace to some 24 hours later when they died. We're also going to ask if France in particular is being singled out by Islamist radicals, and what is the best way to take on Al-Qaeda-linked groups who appear to be getting bolder and bolder. Today in the France 24 debate, France in the firing line with a woman who's based in Niamey, Ariane Kirtley. Thank you for joining us. You're with the humanitarian aid group Aman Iman Water is Life, and you do most of your work in the north of Niger.
That's right.
Okay. Also with us, France 24 politics editor Mark Perlman. From Washington, Walid Fares of the senior fellow at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracy. Welcome back to the France 24 debate. And from Dakar, Senegal, David Lewis of the Reuters news agency. By the way, you can take part in the discussion on the France 24 debate Facebook page. In fact, there you see the page now. Let's look at one of your comments right away here on that page. And this is from Abu Bakr, who writes, "I'm really shocked to see or hear what has happened to our French friends in Niamey. Hakim, that's Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb, lives with us in our cities. That is frightening," he says. Let's begin with the timeline of exactly what happened. The two childhood friends abducted by armed men speaking French, Arabic, and Hausa, a main language in Niger and northern Nigeria, before their execution on the Malian side of the border. There you see the road they allegedly took to that area. David Lewis, what more do we know as to exactly what happened?
Well, as with a lot of these cases where foreigners have been kidnapping, the details are somewhat sketchy, but we do know that obviously they headed north. There was a first contact around 3 o'clock in the morning on Saturday morning between the kidnappers and the Nigerian security forces. There was an exchange of fire. The Nigerians say that they pulled back and they obviously took part in this exchange of fire with caution because they said they didn't want to hurt the two French hostages. Whatever happened, the outcome was that the kidnappers kept heading north towards the Mali border, where there was this second exchange of fire with the Nigerian security forces, and by this stage, the support of the French special forces. Exactly what happened at this exchange of fire again is not yet clear. Nigerian security forces are adamant that the hostages were found dead away from the scene of the exchange of fire. They think that the hostages were executed separately, probably beforehand, and then the exchange of fire took place between the Nigerian security forces backed by the French and the kidnappers.
All right, and of course, Mark Perlman, a lot of the discussion here, and we're going to listen to the French defense minister on this one, a lot of the discussion here is about that decision to aggressively pursue the kidnappers. This is, of course, in the context of 7 employees of the French nuclear group Arriva being abducted in September in the north of Niger.
Yes, absolutely. There's not so much discussion because for now, politicians from all boards kind of show solidarity with the families of the victim, but also with the presidential decision, because it was a presidential decision to attempt a rescue operation very early on, because the concern was that the 2 men were being brought to also become hostages, as the 7 you just mentioned, because obviously the French feel that discussing with the hostage taker has not been working with the 7 people who were abducted. It didn't really work before, and so they felt that they needed to rescue in Niger as close to the capital as possible, because if not, they would escape to areas where there's very little government control and where it would be very difficult to discuss with them. So obviously a very tough line from very early on by the French president. For now, not much criticism, but evidently this does not work, because the 2 French citizens were killed. Hostage takers were also killed and wounded. There's very little information about that. But nevertheless, the rescue operation did not work in the end.
All right, and the Defense Ministry emphasizing that the kidnappers were located some 30 minutes after they broke into that restaurant. And it's a decision that had to be taken quickly.
Not doing anything will be a sign that France is no longer fighting terrorism. We had to make this decision. It was a very important decision to make, and we made it. And we take full responsibility.
Ariane Kirtley, you say you're friends with the family of the bride-to-be in this case. What are your thoughts on the fact that they decided to go after them?
I can talk about the family, and I can also talk as somebody who works in Niamey, works in the field of Niger, and who is also at risk of becoming a hostage. So for the family, I have the greatest compassion. Actually, we constantly talk about the family here in France, and obviously that they're suffering, and it's terrible. But there's also the family in Niger, the Nigerians. Everybody is suffering, and everybody is terrified right now. That's the first thing I have to say. The second thing, as somebody who's at risk of becoming a hostage eventually, they could become a hostage, I think that proactive measures that are taken are necessary. You know, any time that we pay a ransom, that a government pays a ransom, it means that we become more attractive to become eventually a victim. And so I don't know that the right measures were taken, but I think proactivity is necessary. And are there any right answers? That's not something I can answer. But I certainly want to know that if it had been me, then I would have wanted my government to come and try to help me.
All right, let's bring Walid Fares in this, because I know you've worked on these issues closely, even advising the U.S. Congress on them. Your thoughts on the operation itself. But before that, let me ask you this question. The men speaking French, Arabic, and Hausa, what does that tell you about who they were?
Well, any counterterrorism expert looking at the issue in terms of regional dimension, you know, the Hausa element is the most important in this case, because it means that the person has either learned or is coming from areas that are, you know, south of the border with Nigeria and north of the border with Nigeria, which means transnational element. But that is not sure. We need to make sure what is the accent, and that the social scientists can determine that. Now, if I may say that if you are a war room in Paris or other capitals dealing with these issues, the perspective of how the government is perceiving that confrontation can lead the government to make decisions that would affect the tactical operations on the ground. For example, as one of your callers has said, well, or actually has the newspaper in France, Libération, has said that there is a war against France. If there is a war by Al-Qaeda or other networks against France, then when the President, Prime Minister, or other ministers, based on the reports they get from their national security advisors, are going to make a decision, they don't only look at the one operation. Of course, saving the hostages is the most important thing to do. But they would also look at the potential ramification of waiting too long, using the wrong units, paying attention to which government is going to be with or against. And in this case, actually, I think from what we see here, the French national security authorities do understand that they are engaged with a whole web. It's not a local one-time crime or two-time crimes. It's a whole web. Al-Qaeda or not, it's left to be seen.
Do you think, Walid Fares, that this was the actual Islamist militants, or do you think these were just kidnappers who were willing to trade those hostages for money?
It's very difficult to answer at this stage. We need more intelligence, but there is a context. I mean, this is not something happening in a unique fashion. Before that, there were many kidnappings publicized. There were even negotiations with the French government. As you know, one person was killed a few months ago. There are hostages being taken. So the context is between a network that works in those 4 Saheli areas and the French interest. Now, the real question to me, as you said in the introduction, why is it that France is singled out, targeted? There are other, Western interests. Is there beyond Al-Qaeda-France confrontation some sort of will or intention at a very different level that wants the French interest to be out? That's the big question on an analytical level, I'd say.
All right. France often accused of paying ransom as well. And as one Paris-based analyst points out, Paris also not afraid to engage militarily, as was the case in that failed rescue attempt for 78-year-old humanitarian aid worker Michel Germano, who was killed last year.
France has been the only Western nation to attack the group head-on and force it to take some serious losses. Since then, we've been in an endless cycle of revenge attacks.
David Lewis, is there an anti-French feeling that in those countries?
Well, I don't think it's necessarily that tangible. No, I mean, France obviously has a large number of interests and has obviously huge amounts invested in a lot of these countries. There will obviously be those who accuse French of meddling in the region, which is obviously there are a lot of former French colonies in the region. Al-Qaeda in the Islamic Maghreb has played on this the anti-French sentiment. They obviously accuse France of neocolonial activities, and they use a lot of the rhetoric of chasing the Crusaders out. Until recently, there have been the kidnappings have been much more haphazard. It's been isolated cases where people have come across foreigners, be they French or from other nationalities. There have been some Spaniards and other nationalities that have been picked up. We are starting to see, though, perhaps a more targeted anti-French campaign. Obviously, the kidnapping in Arlit in September was clearly targeting these French employees of the mining companies, and this obviously, whether these 2 individuals were specifically targeted or whether they were just the first 2 people that the kidnappers saw in the bar is not clear yet. But they've clearly ended up with yet another French target. So it is going to play into this theory that it's a very clearly anti-French campaign, but I think it's more nuanced.
All right, Mark Proman.
It seems from the information we got that the kidnappers went straight at those 2 people. There were other Westerners in the restaurant, so they knew exactly who they were looking for. And so it seems there is definitely targeting of French interests, because obviously the kidnapping back in September was at a major uranium site, and obviously it's a French economic interest, but also targeting humanitarian workers now and French because of who they are. And in Paris, the way the president especially reacted, using very strong words, barbarians, saying, that French will not obey to the diktat of terrorism. I mean, if it was not Nicolas Sarkozy, it would be George W. Bush in many ways. I mean, it's very strong words because the French clearly feel that this is a war, quote unquote, on terrorism that is being waged over there, and that this is really a proxy war, and the French are indicating that they will go in militarily in a much stronger way, much more direct way that they've been doing until now. It will be seen if the countries where this is taking place will accept this or whether they will reject this.
All right, Ariane Kirtley, I want to get your reaction, but before that, let's listen to those words. The French president on Sunday with, as Mark Proman described them, blunt words for those who carried out this attack.
C'est la nation tout entière.
The whole nation condemns this barbaric act, perpetrated by barbarians.
Un acte
An act of unbelievable cowardice.
What do you think of the French president's words, a barbarian act carried out by barbarians?
I think those are very powerful words. I'm not sure that they will have... I think they have the same effect that Bush tried to have on the Americans. But I don't think they're going to help us living in Niger. I want to go back to your initial question. I want to make it clear that the people that are carrying on these acts are very different than the Nigerians, than the Malians, than the people from Burkina Faso, any of the people in which these countries are taking place. I mean, Nigerians that I know are the most loving and welcoming and caring people that I know. And I think from my end, poverty, yes, poverty can lead to people joining forces with the ACME. But I grew up in Niger. I've spent my entire life in Niger. And I've never felt anti-French sentiment. Yes, there's anger about the uranium mines up north, and that the French are exploiting the uranium and not sharing the profits with the residents of Niger. And I won't get into that. But on a global basis, where I work in the Azawak of Niger, where there are also allies with the ACME, that I've never seen or witnessed anti-French sentiment.
We're almost out of time, but Walid Fares, that's an interesting point. What's daunting about all of this is that the people carrying this act out don't need a lot of popular support, do they?
Of course not. Actually, I mean, what is interesting about the discussion about the narratives, first the French president's narrative, or is it really the political culture on the ground? We miss something, that when governments in the region, including in the Sahel, in Algeria, in Morocco, in Saudi Arabia, in the Arab and Muslim world, when they want to define what Al-Qaeda is and what the terrorists are, they use the same terms, but in Arabic. So it's not that it is absolutely unique that the president of France is using this, of course, because of domestic consumption, because he feels that this is a grave act. Second, obviously societies on the ground, and our colleague has mentioned this, she lived there and she knows, the overwhelming majority of civil societies are just regular people. These are representatives of very extreme elements, which, by the way, and it's important and I close in here, Al-Qaeda uses some issues, ideological issues, recruits from a pool which has already been indoctrinated. You don't have a regular person in Niger or in Mauritania who is told by Al-Qaeda, do it, and then they would just go overnight and do it. They have to be indoctrinated.
Let's pick up on that point after the break. When we return, we're going to look at also pick up on the point you made about poverty being at the center of a lot of these problems throughout the Sahara. Stay with us. The France 24 debate continues.